The Catch a Break podcast is the insider's guide to breaking into and navigating the entertainment industry with me, Julie Harris Oliver. Project Greenlight is a docu-follow show now streaming on Max about the making of an independent film by an emerging director. On season 4 of Catch a Break, these two shows meet. In Catch a Break, we will bring you the behind the scenes of the behind the scenes. We'll talk to producers, the director, the cast, the department heads to hear what it was really like. Watch the show and then come listen to hear what really happened on Catch a Break wherever you get your podcasts. That season of Catch a Break drops July 13th. But right now, you're listening to The Other 50%, a history of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Oliver. You can find me and my consulting work at julieharrisoliver.com, and you can find the podcast at theother50percent.com, all spelled out in letters, as well as on all the podcast places. And you can find links to everything I'm doing on the link tree that is in the show notes. The newest link is for the books that people keep bringing up on the show. I'm calling it the Other 50% Book Club, although there are no meetings, unless you want to drum up a demand. And then we'll figure out how to put that together. But for now, it's the list of books. Okay, one more thing before we meet today's guest. I met the smartest and funniest co-host of my new favorite podcast the other week, and I want to tell you all about it. If you are a woman of a certain age, or headed towards it, or love someone who is, this is for you. And if you remember and liked the Kiss My Age show, you will love Circling the Drain. The concept of a woman circling the drain conjures up negative imagery. But for the hosts of Circling the Drain podcast, they've heard this phrase used so many times in reference to menopause, perimenopause, and the plight of the aging woman that they've chosen to reclaim and repurpose the phrase in the spirit of humor. Co-hosts and longtime friends Ellie and Julia take a deep dive into the sometimes embarrassing, often hilarious, always bewildering issues of hormonal changes that take place in midlife. Through honest accounts, thoughtful interviews, and group panel discussions, their mission is to make you chuckle, make you nod your head in recognition, and hopefully make some scientific progress. Tune in to Circling the Drain podcast every other Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts. Today on the podcast, we are diving into disability and accessibility and how to invite and manage people and their needs on set. This feels like one of the lesser discussed pillars in the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and I'm really happy we have Kiah Amara on the show today to help us start thinking about it and planning for it. Kiah is a disabled, queer, non-binary producer, activist, and production accessibility coordinator. Originally from the rural Midwest, they now work globally expanding ideas of accessibility, disability, and all things deviant from normal through their company, IndieVISIBLE Entertainment. Kiah is the PAC, Production Accessibility Coordinator, on Best Foot Forward on AppleTV+, which was featured in the New York Times and awarded a 2022 Ruderman Seal of Authenticity. Other work includes Netflix by RespectAbility Children's Content Lab, The Greatest Ad, Rosie's Rules, CBS and WarnerBros Discovery Talent Initiatives, and accessibility lead for the Far Out product launch at Steve Jobs Theater. Okay, here, have a listen. Kiah Amara, welcome to The Other 50%.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello. So I want to start with you and your origin story. How did you get into the business and what are all the things that you do?
Yeah, so I always really love talking about this because I have such a long history in disability space and in art space. So, and a long history of being disabled, even though I didn't always identify as disabled. So my sort of original point of origin is actually from a group called Penguin Project, which is a community theater companion program. So being from the rural Midwest, of course, community theater is a big thing. Penguin Project started in Illinois in Peoria, and I was part of the DeKalb group, the DeKalb Sycamore group that was sort of the second iteration of this. And basically what it was a program that was a bunch of disabled folks paired with non-disabled mentors doing a musical. And the whole point is that it was all the disabled folks who were all the leads, and the non-disabled folks were just shadow mentors. But the thing that was really, really wonderful about the program is that it wasn't about teaching social skills to disabled folks or about teaching, language or anything like that. Obviously, being in theater is great for many reasons, but this program, I was actually in it as a non-disabled mentor. And through the program, we would have every week something where the mentors would go, okay, here's how you lead a blind person, or here's how Braille works, or here's how to have a conversation with somebody who's nonverbal. So it was really just all about the mentors being in a space of, hey, these are new people, new communication styles, new engaging with environment styles that you might not be familiar with or comfortable with. So we're just going to teach you how to be comfortable with everything and how to get along with everybody. And that was so reverse because this was 2009 as well. So that was so
Yeah.
reverse of what most programs are. Because again, most everything was, teaching disabled people how to seem less disabled in spaces so that they could fit in. And this was a space that wholly taught, okay, folks who don't identify as disabled, here's how to just know everybody and see everybody in, a relationship sort of way. And that program included what was called friendship time at the end, which was basically just time for non-disabled and disabled people to sit around and talk with one another and hang out with one another and just be used to having conversations together. So even though I was disabled and had my disability at that time, I didn't identify as disabled. Again, 2009 in the Midwest, I was somebody who was considered very low need. I was a dancer and got straight A's and all of that. So I was not somebody who could possibly be disabled. But that program was definitely a space where I was like, oh, these are my people. And I sort of recognized them as my people before I was recognizing, myself as disabled. And then I had a whole long string of things working with Penguin Project for many years. I became sort of a liaison and did a bunch of stuff in the Midwest, helping other people start Penguin Project programs. I did disability art with Chicago Children's Theater right out of college, and then moved to New York and worked with New York City Children's Theater and did sensory friendly performances with them. And that was sort of how production accessibility started, was in doing these sensory friendly performances. A lot of production accessibility comes from theater spaces and making theater spaces or like live shows and galleries accessible. And then moved over to film TV because I had always really loved film and television as an actor, and that space felt so much more inaccessible than the theater world. And then just sort of went from there. It's a big tumble from this really amazing volunteer experience when I was young in community theater space all the way up to, things in New York City and LA now. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I love that. And I had some questions from the very beginning of that story. First of all, what was the musical?
Oh, so what was the very first musical that we did? There's actually a big thing with what musical comes first. In each iteration, you do the same first musical, and I can't remember what it was. I want to say it was Annie. Annie might have been the first thing that we did, but I did a whole bunch of musicals with them, so I can't even remember at this point what the first one that we did was. We had done Music Man. They did Beauty and the Beast. We did Little Mermaid, but I think the first one was Annie.
A classic.
Yes, a classic. And actually, I do remember now because I was a mentor to two different folks. I was a mentor to the person who played Annie, and I was a mentor to somebody else who was one of the orphans. So it was super cool because I got to be there like all the time and hang out with everybody all the time. So, yeah.
And how did you hear about that opportunity in the first place? Like, how'd you first come to, I'm going to do this thing?
So yeah, again, I'm from a really small town in rural Illinois. So for our community theater space, it was sort of like, if you know people in the local community theater space, you know everybody in the local community theater space. So when they decided that they were going to do the program, they just sort of sent out a notice to everybody of like, hey, this is the thing we're doing. This is Penguin Project. Feel free to come to the onboarding and do this summer show with us, because they always took place. Rehearsals were all over the summer, and then you do the show sort of first thing in the fall in the school year, and just knew I wanted to do it right away and was ready to go. A lot of folks who were part of the theater space were friends already from the community theater space in my town. So being able to do a specific show that was just, not focused on us and was focused on other people who didn't get as many theater opportunities in the space was super exciting. So I don't remember ever not thinking about it.
So let's talk about how you got into, I suppose that did lead to the advocacy work and kind of that evolution. But can you talk about specifically how you got into the advocacy work for film and television?
Yeah, so when I graduated, and I went to school in Wisconsin, so the first place I lived after school was Chicago, and was working with Red Kite, which is a disability program that's a part of Chicago Children's Theater, and was also just sort of teaching in the general, Chicago school area through Chicago Children's Theater. And there's another program called Able Ensemble in Chicago, which also does film. They do like film shorts, things like that as a part of their program, which is also a theater-based program. And so meeting all of the folks who I had met in the Chicago space, I was really interested in transitioning just from theater to doing more in film and TV. My degree in theater arts and musical theater, I was an actor at the time. And so I was really interested in making the space that I was largely working in, which was TV, film, commercials, that sort of stuff, more accessible, because I had been in the theater space and knew that I could bring everybody into the theater space, and the theater space was really welcoming. But I had found, not only for myself, but for my friends, that the issue in TV and film was sort of twofold. One, if you have a non-apparent disability like me, I'm also usually not particularly apparently queer to folks and not particularly apparently non-binary to folks, that it became this situation where, casting folks or creative people would be like, but you're not what the audience expects from disability. So I can't cast you in this disabled role because the audience won't get it, which was always very hard for me because, as I said, from Penguin Project, even though I didn't identify at the time, I knew those were my people and that was my community. And that was sort of my long journey to realizing, oh, I am disabled. I am neurodiverse. That's why I feel so, akin to all these people who do already identify as disabled. And the other piece of it being, so many production spaces were talking about, oh, we'd love to have more disabled folks, but they have too many needs. It's too risky. It's too this. It's on and on and on.
Right.
So
Cables, lights, equipment.
Yep. And there's a great Venn diagram image, which I can't remember the name of the artist right now, but I will send it to you later. That basically just has the Venn diagram of not disabled enough to too disabled. And of course, not disabled enough is like, you're not allowed to be on benefits. You can't be seen as disabled, all of this. And the bottom is like the assisted suicide space. And the only thing that's the acceptable amount of disabled is inspiration porn. And I think, especially at that time, was really, really true in, the media space of disability as well, which is like, there's one kind of disability. Also, non-apparent disability is not really a thing. And we definitely don't cast authentically for non-apparent disability, and on and on. So
can we talk about the definitions a bit? Because you just identified as queer, non-binary, neurodivergent. I would suspect the queer, non-binary is not in the disability category.
No, so it's not. IndieVISIBLE. So my company is IndieVISIBLE Entertainment. We very much focus on queer, TGNC, which is transgender nonconforming, and disability stories. And that's because that's how I identify. But one of the things that I actually give talks on this too is that there is so much disability crossover in so many other communities. Being queer, not a disability, being trans, not a disability. Obviously, there are additional pieces of that when we're talking about the social model of disability, right? Which is that disability is, are you disabled by the barriers that are placed in front of you? And I think, there are elements of that in a lot of different culture spaces of what are the barriers that make engaging with society disabling. Not inherently a disabled identity, though. We keep those things in two different places as far as communities and cultures go. But there's so much disability in the queer space, especially neurodiversity. The percentage of autistic folks who also identify as queer is like 76%. So there's a close connection there a lot of the times.
Yeah, and I'm also hearing the accommodation may be the piece to focus on rather than all the different disability categorizations.
100%. And that's absolutely where we are as far as production and accessibility goes too. It's really easy to fall into what we call compliance mindset, which is that sort of fear of the Americans with Disabilities Act, fear of the ADA, and fear of getting sued for not doing what the ADA requires of you.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of that requires specific disability, sometimes requires specific diagnosis, sometimes requires specific, medical documentation. And getting so much of that is not only inaccessible for a lot of intersectional reasons, it's also sometimes not safe for folks to have. So we rely a lot more on just trusting folks.
Believing them when they tell you who they are?
Yeah, which is a piece of what's called access intimacy. But that piece of access intimacy is just like, you tell me what you need and I make it happen. You don't need to prove to me why you need it. We don't need to have a fight over it. And we found this to be really successful on production as well, because of course, those productions that want to bring disabled folks in and then only give disabled folks what they need can create a lot of animosity. As in any workspace, you don't want to be sitting doing your job and seeing somebody being taken care of and know that you're sitting next to them on a 12-hour production day and you're not allowed to go get a drink of water. So making sure that accessibility, again, when we come into production, we send out a survey to every single person and say, tell us what you need. You don't have to identify as disabled. You don't have to be connected with the community. Even if you are connected with the community, you don't have to tell us. You can just tell us what you need. And I think that's super important in the world at large, but especially in film TV production.
Everywhere, and especially all our workplaces.
Yeah.
So it's like if you're really going to focus on inclusion and belonging, that means making the place accessible for everybody and helping everybody with what they need. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. I always laugh with DEI, DEIA, IDEA, DBIA, all of the different iterations that, that space has been, that I have told many a person, like, for me, it doesn't matter until you put the A first, because for me, true accessibility includes all of those things. All of those things can fall under sort of the widest version of accessibility, which is that it doesn't, you can't have belonging if somebody can't get in the door. You can't have diversity if somebody can't get in the door. So the first thing you have to do is make the space accessible.
Okay, so let's talk about, what does that mean? Because I think people may have ideas of what accessibility means, but what does it actually mean? And did you create this job, or you're doing this job of helping sets become accessible? So let's talk about that.
So IndieVISIBLE, we have a very specific framework, and that framework is simplifying. So for us, we always use this sort of 2-sentence phrase, which is, accessibility is a state of easy engagement, and accommodation is the flexibility that we use to get there.
Would you say that one more time?
Mm-hmm. Accessibility is a state of easy engagement, and accommodation is the flexibility that we use to get there.
Okay. Say more about that.
It is so easy. Again, this compliant mindset, right? The disability umbrella is huge. It's 25% of the US population. Even me, who, I've been working in this since 2009, engaging with tons of individuals in the community, engaging with the community at large on an international scale, I don't know everything that everybody needs. I don't have a solution for every space, and I never will, because every time I meet a disabled person, even if, it's 100 people who all have CP, cerebral palsy, every single one of them can have a different need. That's even a saying for, autism and ADHD. You meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism.
I was about to say that.
So, yeah, exactly. So you're like, it's true across the disability community, though, not just for autism or neurodiversity, that everybody has their own unique experience of disability. And to think that you can encompass 25% of the population in any one, in any one bucket. In any one bucket is just, it's mind-blowing to me that sometimes people think that that's even possible. So again, we were talking about like the bogging down, right? That people get really overwhelmed with knowing the specific answers beforehand, and like knowing, oh, A equals B. If the person comes in a wheelchair, this is what they need. And it just doesn't work that way at all. That for us, we always push people to, you shouldn't be spending, if you're a new producer, right? And this is your first time working with disability community, or you just want to be more inclusive of disability in your set, a lot of times folks dive into, okay, let's go to the ADA. What do I need to do? What are my legal rules? What are my very specific guidelines?
Because it sounds overwhelming if you think, oh, I'm going to have 150 people on my crew. I have to accommodate everybody's what? Where do I even start? I mean, that feels like a very simple, it has a list. I can do the checklist.
Yes, everybody always asks for the checklist. And for us, we always just start with, you just have to open a dialogue. That's really all it is. You send out an email that says, this production cares about your accessibility. We care about this space being easy for you to engage with. Please let us know what you need from us. And if you don't know, let's have a conversation and come up with a solution together. And that's really all it is. And everything else grows and builds from there. Of course, we love disabled leadership because disabled folks are the ones who have spent their lifetimes figuring out accommodations for things, figuring out workarounds, figuring out how to come up with those accessibility solutions and those accommodation solutions. It's why we only work with disabled PACs, not only because they have the life experience to get it done. PACs are production accessibility coordinators. But the reason why we only work with disabled folks is because not only do they have the life experience to come up with those solutions, they have the community connections to know, oh, well, here's a solution that worked for a friend of mine. Let's try that. Here's a solution that worked for a friend of a friend. Let's try that. But then they also are there to create a safe space for other disabled folks or folks with access needs to step forward and say, okay, I wasn't comfortable telling, my executive producer that I have profound hearing loss on one side because I was worried that they wouldn't let me use a walkie-talkie and they wouldn't hire me because they would think that I couldn't do the job. But to you, knowing that you're also disabled, I'm okay to go, hey, here's my issue, here's my disability, what's the solution that we can use? That's the same reason why we keep everything sort of, even if there's disclosure, we don't share disclosures, things like that. It's all just, how can we be in dialogue to come up with the best possible solutions? And again, all of the experience is still wonderful, just like it's wonderful in any job. I can come into a set and know, oh, there's a temperature issue. Great. Here's 3 solutions for somebody who has, an overheating issue, regardless of if they have a disability, regardless of if they've told me about it.
Every
Great.
woman in menopause would appreciate the temperature going down a couple notches.
Exactly. And that's 100% the thing, is that we have been so focused just on disabled folks. And again, we still are, as leadership, and recognizing that disabled folks are the ones who have been excluded from the space, but also recognizing that the whole industry just needs to shift and become more accessible in order to open that door for disabled creatives, disabled leadership, and disabled crew.
So I would guess people's first instinct, if they're new to this, would be, oh, we need to hire a production accessibility coordinator if I'm doing a show about people with disabilities. I'm guessing you would disagree with that.
I would disagree with that. However, I'm not mad about it being a starting point. And it 100% is usually our starting point. It's folks who are in pre-production, just about to go into production, who are looking at their list of things going, oh, wait, wow, I actually don't know anything that's happening. I probably should have brought somebody in sooner who understands more of the details of how we can find solutions for the things that we're approaching. But some of the most wonderful productions that I've been on are folks who, it's not a disability themed space. Maybe one of the lead creatives is disabled, and so they thought about accessibility. Or it's somebody who has met me prior and was like, I just didn't know how accessibility might fit into this project. So I want to have a conversation about it. I want to know what we can do. I want to know what we can add. Again, whether you have a really small space and it's, 30 people working on your short, or you have a massive series and it's 1,000 people working on the project across multiple sound stages, all you have to do is remember that disabled folks are 1 in 4, right? 25% of your space.
You have disabled people on your crew. You just may not know it.
Right. They don't want to disclose for you. There's been no reason for them to, disclose that information when it's likely on crew, especially for folks who are IATSE, which is everybody who's sort of below the line crew. Those folks are not used to being taken care of. They're used to being told
Power through.
They're used to being told if you have the time to sit, you're doing your job wrong. You should be running around all the time, which is the same reason why we have pipeline issues for disability, because so many of those entry-level roles are not accessible to disabled people. But those are the folks who we go in with a big focus on, that you're like, nobody wants to tell you they're disabled in that space because you won't hire them again. not only will you not give them what they need, you're not going to hire them again. So there's been absolutely no reason for folks to identify as disabled. And even for us, our data and experience has shown that when we do come into a production and we're getting folks' feedback, we start out with like 11 to 15% of folks identifying as disabled. And that percentage rises by the end of production. You have more people who are saying, oh, actually, I am disabled. Oh, actually, I do identify with, dyslexia or OCD or whatever it may be, chronic migraines, things like that, that all fall under the disability umbrella. But so many folks don't identify with the culture space because historically it has been more dangerous than helpful to do that.
Yeah. And things like, I'm just thinking of the chronic migraine thing. Women are so conditioned to have their pain disregarded that we're just going to work through regardless. I just heard about the UK having business accommodation for women in menopause. So doing things like having fans on desks or having more flexibility depending on how people feel, like that seems revolutionary also. Anyway, two tracks I'd love to go down with you. Like, I'd love to hear some like concrete accommodations that you help people with. And also I want to talk about representation on screen. So why don't we first talk about accommodations that you help people with? I'm curious, do you typically go on set for the duration or for a consultation at the beginning or somewhere in between?
It can be a big swath of things. So we're sort of in the place now where the work has progressed enough that because we've been in enough spaces in pre-production and production, folks are starting to realize, oh yeah, this would have been really useful to think about this in development. Or, oh, it would have been really nice to keep you on in post and to talk about PR and marketing and what makes marketing accessible and what things reach the disability community and how does the disability community want to be communicated with. So now we're sort of expanding our timeline of a project. It used to be that we'd be brought in for, a consultation in pre-production, and then we do a couple odd days of production. And usually it was days where there were, lots of disabled actors in the space, because of course productions still always think about their actors and their talent before they think about their crew. And now we've sort of extended past that, where now we're doing our consultations in development and letting folks know in advance, like, here's the things you should keep in mind. Here's the things that you want to be aware of now that can make a big impact, even in your audience engagement, however many months or years down the line that might be for a specific project. So that's really wonderful because, again, it's not only we're expanding our work, but it's also people expanding their understanding of how accessibility and disability are really integrated into everything that we're doing. So I would say that's where we're at now. It's usually, a couple meetings, things like that in development. If it's a very disability heavy project, we might do more support in those sort of early stages, and then on for most of pre-production and production, and then a little bit of post, and then again moves into the consultation in post and in marketing and PR, but always hoping to expand that fully. I think the thing that's really interesting now is, of course, PACs, so production accessibility coordinators. For IndieVISIBLE, those are specifically designed as a role that can have trainees, that can have PAs or PAAs, production accessibility assistants, who work as a part of that team. And we're specifically building it as an entry point for disabled people to the space, right? Because as I mentioned, PAs, those are really inaccessible positions because those are usually the people who are asked to run around the most, to do the most on walkies, to lift the most weight, to all of these sorts of things that are not particularly accessible for a lot of different disabled folks. So for us, we're creating a space where people can come in, have an entry level position, and also do a lot of good across all the departments. So specifically being a coordinator, right? We didn't build this to be its own department. We built it to be something that integrates with every single department because every department has its own connection to accessibility, whether that's wardrobe for talent or, construction needs to make sure that they're building space wide enough for a wheelchair, whatever it may be. But we also always push, right, that so many people are bringing in disabled consultants as writers or bringing in disabled consultants as consulting producers. So Inevitable Foundation, which is a nonprofit org that focuses on mid-career disabled writers, has some really wonderful tools and also some really wonderful articles, data, research, all about how sort of folks creating different versions of writers or different versions of producers where it's, they're creating a unique box in order to sort of underpay disabled folks in a lot of spaces when really they should just be hiring a disabled writer. And for our side of stuff, that is, people should just be hiring a disabled producer, right? You should just be hiring
as a producer.
A producer. Yes, as a producer. So that's sort of the space we're in now, is that as folks see more and more purpose for production accessibility and sort of realize how much it's integrated into everything, now our advocacy has sort of become, great, we would love to have a PAC on your set. It seems like you have lots of needs for budgeting, for going through your scripts and making sure that, we always use the example of like, did you need to choose a grass field for that? Or can it be, a blacktop behind a school somewhere for that school festival? Because one of those locations is very inaccessible and is going to be very hard to get people around. And one of them is much more accessible. But all of that is just the creative work that a disabled producer can do. And producers already have specific focuses. There are so many specialized producers. So to bring in somebody who is a producer, who is just disabled, who has the ability to, help with your line budgeting, help with your set accessibility, help with all the creative choices that will affect how accessible your space can be, is also so important, but is different from somebody who's just boots on the ground, coordinating your access, walking around set, making sure that that bathroom, stays accessible and doesn't get 10 boxes of, toilet paper stacked in front of the door so that you can't get in it anymore. They're very different jobs with very different functions. And we're all here for, building the careers of disabled creatives and crew.
Great. Now, I've heard you talk in the past about looking at things from physical accessibility, making sure that people can get around on a set. And also, which was new for me to hear about, accessibility, like how do you need your call sheet printed out, or do you need it printed out, or how do you, the communication accessibility. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so we always break this down into 3 pieces when we're talking about accessibility. We talk about space, time, and communication. And that's another sort of framework for our simplification is that it's space, time, and communication. So the communication piece of that is huge and is always the first thing that we're tackling. So when we send out our initial survey, the first piece of that survey is, how do you want us to communicate with you? And that might be somebody saying, I need you to text me, or I need you to voice call me, or somebody who's deaf saying, dear God, don't voice call me. You can text me or you can video call me and make sure there's ASL. So it's just all about starting that conversation around how can we listen and talk to each other in the best way that works for both of us. So some of the things that happen in communication then, like you mentioned with digital accessibility, that's one of the first things that we usually tackle, and that ask goes out in our survey, because those are all free things that we can do really easily. Again, as somebody who is a disabled producer and PAC in the space, I already know how to do that. So if you hire me, you hire that skill set as disabled creative, or again, as production accessibility. So being able to turn something into dark mode, being able to switch a script that has to get printed out, into a large print script, being able to say, okay, where do I need to go to get a Braille script made? Where do I need to go in order to turn this into dyslexia accessible font, right? All of those things that are very small pieces, but can make a really big change for somebody. Sometimes that's as simple as like, oh, your email, if you can write it twice and post the second part in dyslexia accessible font, right? It's all of those really, really tiny things that are free that folks just don't think about as making a big difference. I'm a spoonie. I have a chronic medical disability. So we talk a lot about spoons, which is basically a measure of energy and how much energy you have to do things in a day. And so we always just talk about all these tiny pieces are about just saving spoons. If I can make it easier for you to read this email or easier for you to read this script, then you have spoons, you have the energy to do a bunch of other things in your day that you need to do, and you're not wasting your energy trying to get around barriers that don't need to be there.
What's a spoonie?
So spoonie is the community term for folks with chronic medical disabilities. And the term was designed because it's based on what's called spoon theory, which again is it's a communication process that's used to describe chronic fatigue. So it's like disabled folks speaking to non-disabled folks talking about chronic fatigue, which is that everybody has a certain amount of spoonfuls of energy every day. And so somebody who doesn't have a chronic medical disability or doesn't have chronic fatigue might have 10 spoons, and somebody who does might only have 5. And each task that you're trying to do in the day, depending on how complicated or simple that task is, takes a certain number of spoons. So like eating breakfast might take 1 spoon, and going to a doctor's appointment where you have to get an MRI might take 3 spoons. And if you overspend your spoons on one day, then you have even less spoons the next day, which is a really great piece of what we talk about when we talk about time as accommodation, which is that crib time, which is the term for functioning within a time space that recognizes disability and different accessibility needs.
What word did you just say?
Crib time.
Okay.
that phrase is specifically about recognizing accessibility and how we deal with time, which recognizes spoon theory as well. And this is why we always focus on simplifying, because I can use a lot of words that are culturally relevant and that mean something to the culture, but really it just means how much energy do you have and how much time does that mean it takes you to do things.
I'm learning so much talking to you. I wish I knew about the spoonie thing when I was working in production and suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
That explains the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay. And then, so time might be the time it might take someone to get to set, or the time it might take someone to do something that people don't think of, because be on set in 30 seconds may not be a reasonable request of people.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the super important thing about crib time too recognizes things like New York. Working in New York is a really great example of this, because there are accessible buses, right? There's accessible transportation. And so everybody thinks that you can make it there in the same amount of time that it would take somebody to just walk out their door and hop on the subway and get to a location. But most folks don't realize that only a very small percentage of the subway system in New York is actually accessible and has elevators. And of that, only a very small percentage of those elevators actually work. It's something like 25% of those elevators are down every single day.
All the time. And they're at the furthest end of the platform. And if you're late, you can't be running between trains. Yeah, that all makes tons of sense.
Yep. And even if you do, charter one of the accessible buses or things like that, they don't design their routes around you. So most disabled folks have to build in an extra 2 hours of leeway time to try and make it to their location. And they still don't have control over if that bus comes on time. So they're relying on a bunch of barriers working with them in order to make a certain schedule work, which again that's all part of the social model of disability, is that the expectation, right, is, oh, the wheelchair user, they're slow, that's why they're here late. And you're like, no, the wheelchair users, they're late because they have access to a sixth of the transportation options that you have. And the one that you might think works the best actually takes an extra 2 hours, and they don't have control over the driver. And also the driver just walked off the bus to go do something and they don't know what it is. And on and on and on. So that it's all the extra time that it takes to get around those barriers and come up with creative solutions. And also the energy that it takes to come up with those creative solutions and go around those barriers.
I mean, I'm exhausted just hearing about it. Yes. It's like, it's so hard. And also, just going back to language, like that term crib time doesn't feel like something I should say. Like that feels like, it sounds like a derogatory term.
So the word crib is obviously, it's a reclaimed word for the disability community that's based off of the term cripple. I think much like the queer community, again, as I said, there's lots of, camaraderie between queer community and disabled community. Much like there are words in the queer community that have been reclaimed words, disability community has that same thing. For words like crip time or crip rage, those are things that are terms that you can just reference. That being said, yes, you should not call anybody a crip who hasn't self-identified that way.
Yeah.
You shouldn't, that's very much a word as far as like using it as an identity term. That's only used within the disability community. But things like crip time and crip rage, at least for me personally, I am always more than happy to hear people use those terms because it's identifying, again, it exists within the social model of disability. And what it's really saying is not only do you recognize this disability issue, but you also have the culture knowledge to know the disability terminology for it. And I think that's really wonderful and cool.
Okay, but you wouldn't want to say like, oh, they're late, crip time. Like,
I think it depends on your framework for that. And again, if you are a non-disabled person, and if you are a straight white non-disabled person in a room full of straight white non-disabled leadership waiting on one disabled
dicey.
person. Yeah, one disabled person to come in. It's all about your power structures, right? And if you can actually have a conversation with somebody and say, hey, so there's actually a word for this. There's a word for why this person is late all the time. And it's called crip time. And it's about all the barriers that person has to face in order to get into this room. Then you can recognize that word in the really positive space that it is designed to occupy. Because again, you really have to recognize both the functional and the cultural side of that word.
So context is very important.
Context is very important, yes.
What is crip rage?
So crip rage is sort of twofold. Crip rage has to do with the anger that disabled people feel for having to deal with all the barriers in the world, right? So
Makes
it's
sense.
specifically a rage at all the barriers. It's a rage at ableism. It's a rage at all of those things. That's sort of its most common use, right? It's just like crip time, where you're like, it has a very cultural context where you're like, it's a rage against ableism that disabled people feel because we have to deal with it all the time. The other piece of it that I really feel as spoony, and this is much more like, a community held, identity held thing, is that I experience crip rage a lot when I want to do something and my body on that day has decided, too bad, you can't.
And raging.
And so it's a very specific anger that's about that, or that's about, disabled folks usually have a very, very high pain tolerance. And so that, one side of crip rage being when I'm interacting with the medical system and a doctor asks me for my pain level and I can say with a straight face, oh, it's like an 8. I'm often told, oh, it must not be because of how you're reacting. And that's a part of that sort of crip rage space too, is I'm telling you who I am and what the experience is, and I'm not being listened to. And also, the personal side of it being, I'm trying to do something with my day or my body, or, I did want to be at that meeting and now I've woken up and my knee's not working. Or, I'm supposed to have a voiced interview and now my voice isn't working. So I have to either try and find an interpreter last minute or do, it all spirals as well. But I think the thing that's always important about it is it's all within that social model of disability, where it's like, yeah, sometimes it's personal and disability related. But even with the medical, my medical example, it's largely about the barriers that if it weren't for all those barriers, I wouldn't need to feel bad about the fact that I wanted to do this thing today and now I can't, or I wanted to do this. I wanted to work on this thing for my job today and I can't. And part of that crip rage, again, is I can direct that anger at myself because I feel guilty. But all of that is, ableism as well. So really, it's this rage at, the ableist system that we live within.
That reminded me of, I just heard, the new Michael J. Fox docuseries that's out.
Still,
and
the
the director,
wonderful.
And he was talking about one day Michael showed up and he was like, well, how are you today? And Michael was like, well, actually, I'm in excruciating pain. And he was like, I had no idea. He's like, well, I live with it every day and I just carry on. It's like, what?
Yeah. I think have you seen the film yet?
I've seen, I think, the first episode.
So I think I saw it at the premiere at South by when Michael was actually there to talk as well, which was amazing. So cool to be in the same room as Michael J. Fox. But part of that episode being too that Michael's like, because he asks in the interview, like, oh, well, why didn't you tell me? And Michael says, well, you didn't ask. And I think that's something too of accessibility at large, right? Is that anybody who has an accessibility need is used to just handling it and doing what they need to do. And I think something that's always important for folks to remember, both on the disabled side and the non-disabled side, is that people do want to help and support and make things accessible. It's just that the world is so big and diverse that a lot of times we're just not thinking about it at all. And it doesn't remotely cross our mind that somebody is in pain or can't get in the room but wants to be in the room or whatever it may be, that's such an important thing. And I love that I can say that I get to echo something that Michael J. Fox said in my work, which is you didn't ask. And I think that's why that communication piece and always just starting with an open dialogue is truly, truly, if only one thing matters, it's that, is you just have to ask.
Yeah, like let's not force people to be heroic every day. Like you can make things a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm.
And then can you just touch on the space part of it a little bit?
Yeah, so space is a lot more of those things that you think of as sort of basic ADA, right? Where you're like, okay, according to the ADA, a wheelchair user needs 36 inches of space, 36 inches wide and 60 inches to make a turnaround. It's also things like, okay, sensory friendly space. What does that look like? Can we have a room where the lights are dimmable and where there's lower noise and we can put, some sensory friendly objects in there like headphones and whatever it may be to make those spaces more accessible. Those are a lot more tangible. Anything that's space related is much more tangible, but still includes that piece as well of like, the ADA is a fantastic place to start a conversation. And if you have the capacity and the finances and the time to rebuild everything so that it exists exactly to ADA standard, amazing, do that and then do more. But I know so many folks who are like, ADA is great. I would love to have that. I don't. So how can I get, a curb ramp that I can have right here so that even though this sidewalk doesn't have a curb cut, even though it legally should, because the ADA is over 30 years old, it doesn't. So now what do I do? And that piece again of like, great, start with the ADA. If you can make that happen, perfect. Otherwise, everything becomes a one-on-one conversation. Same with, again, our accessibility spaces. If you can have your own independent room that you can use as sensory relief space, we always make a point to have that on every single one of our sets. And we do a lot of ultra low budget, super small indie. It just matters what your priority is. And obviously prioritizing folks' well-being is something that we think everybody should do. But if you don't have it, then it's great. What can I keep in my fanny pack? Can I keep earplugs in my fanny pack? Can I, what else can I offer in the space? Can we have somebody who gives a warning when there's going to be flashing lights by the camera or for a scene that's happening on set? All of those things that have to do with how people engage with the physical space.
Now, can we talk a bit about representation and where we are on that journey?
Oh, yes. I think we're so much better, again, as I said, starting out in 2009 and being used to, folks being like, well, you're not disabled enough and you're too disabled. That still exists. But I think we have a lot more disabled leadership who's in the space, a lot more folks who have been in the space for a long time who are now identifying as disabled, and a lot more advocates who are super interested and excited about including disabled creativity in their projects. Luckily, it seems like the authentic casting piece is pretty much a given now, right? Folks expect that if you're casting somebody for a disabled part, that person should be disabled. The term for that is, if you don't cast authentically, is actually called the crip up. So another place where that word comes back into play. So if you're casting inauthentically, a lot of times now that's sort of an automatic boycott from the community. So people will avoid that as much as possible, which is fantastic. However, and again, Inevitable Foundation has some really great, writing on this. We have also found that as disabled representation increases on screen, we haven't found an equal rise in disabled people identifying with those characters and saying, yes, that's me. As the characters have risen, the percentage is actually lower for folks saying it's an accurate representation. And that's because we still really lack the behind the camera representation from disability.
Okay, let's unpack that. So producers may say, oh, let's put a wheelchair using person in this show.
Mm-hmm.
Check. But perhaps they don't have a full backstory and authentic experience. They're just, I'm thinking of that character in Glee. What was that kid's name? You know the one. Who would that get up and dance?
Archie.
Yeah.
There's always memes about that wheelchair dive into the swimming pool. But it's less that, because it's really wonderful to see, you have a procedural show and the nurse at the front desk is, limb different, right? That's great. That's an under 5 role, meaning she doesn't have a lot of lines. Maybe she only says 2 lines in that entire episode. But disability was apparent in the space. It doesn't matter. That person doesn't need to have a backstory. That's actually a really common faux pas. And I don't know if that's the right word, but it's what my brain is bringing up, is that because disability has been so underrepresented, a lot of times people avoid casting disabled folks in everyday roles because the cycle of misrepresentation, the word for that too is the perception gap. The perception gap is that, oh, there's a person in a wheelchair there. There must be a reason they're disabled. Like there must be a story about their bravery and overcoming. And there can't just be disabled people who exist.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be the main focus.
Right. Disabled people are passed over for small roles because folks who are looking at it go, oh, perception gap. Oh, if they see a disabled person, though, there'll need to be a reason for them to be disabled, which no, disabled people just exist. We're just around.
Just let them work the front desk. You don't have to do a deep dive.
Right. They can do whatever it is. But the other side of that being that when people do go after disabled storylines and want to tell disabled stories, a lot of times you have a bunch of non-disabled people telling that story. And that's how you wind up with situations. I mean, I have a fantastic in front of the camera example, which is that an autistic actor who was cast for a role is a relatively low need autistic person, so potentially a non-apparent disability for some folks, had to study Rain Man, which is a crip up, to perform autism the way the creatives wanted them to perform autism, even though they themselves are autistic. And I think that's very true in, background creative space too, right? Where we get these terrible, terrible representations like Me Before You and like music, where there's no community input. It's just somebody who is still living in what's called the charity model in their head, right? They're saying, oh, I'll be a good Samaritan. I'll tell a disabled story so that disabled people can see themselves represented on screen. But if it's a non-disabled person who's writing the character, who's designing their story, who's controlling the lens of the camera, who's doing all of the work for, what that story actually is, then whether or not you cast somebody who is authentically disabled to play that character, you're still going to have the disability community going, well, that's not my experience of being disabled. Because again, you wind up with all these portrayals that the creative core of them is non-disabled and comes from a non-disabled lens, which is why, again, with that piece of okay, who's your disabled producer? Who's your disabled director? Who's your disabled writer? All of that is what we actually need when we talk about this word again, cripping the lens. If you want a disabled lens, if you want a disabled story, you have to have the disabled creatives. And production accessibility is supposed to be there as a support for everybody. Production accessibility isn't a creative tool to work around a bunch of non-disabled people who have decided to tell a non-disabled story and realized way too late that they're wildly off base and, very lost in a perception gap of what disabled lives are really like. So that's sort of the big push now, right? Is just making folks realize that the perception gap exists and that they have been looking at disability and at disabled lives and at disabled people through the haze of this media perception gap that has existed for so long. And we have to get more disabled folks behind the camera. And again, that production accessibility is really just there to support that happening. We want to be there to back up the disabled writer, disabled director, disabled producer, and let them do the real creative work that needs to happen to see more authentic disabled stories.
And we hear very parallel stories with race and actors, right? America Ferrera tells a story about she'd go to auditions and they'd be, you have to be more Latina. She's like, I can't be more Latina than I am. I'm what?
I am, yeah.
Because I am that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Interesting.
There's lots of it that has to do with that multi-intersectional piece too, which again is a whole other podcast section. But since we're a queer TGNC disabled company, we talk a lot about that. And as you said, with the racial piece of it too, we just worked on another short with somebody who's an Afro-Latina who's disabled, who also cast a deaf Afro-Latina in their short just to play a random role because it was the right actor. And so the set spoke 4 languages, right? The piece itself was multilingual English, Spanish, but we also had Brazilian Latinos who were speaking Portuguese, and we had ASL as a part of the set space too, that so many of those stories, right, are then, oh, well, this world can't exist because it's too many things at once. And that's how media looks at it. And I have absolutely
unlike the world.
Yep, I have absolutely been in rooms too where somebody's like, oh, well, if they're Black, we can't also have them be disabled. Or, oh, if they're trans, we can't also have them be lesbian. Like they have to be one or the other. Otherwise, it will overwhelm the audience. And I think that's something we so have to get past. Like the audience is smarter than that, and the audience wants more than that. And also, we all have friends who come from very diverse intersectional spaces, even if we ourselves don't identify that way. Like you have somebody in your life who is that thing. I always love talking about getting to see Everything Everywhere All at Once for the first time, because that's a disability film, right? That's a neurodiversity film that's all about ADHD. For as much as, yes, it is absolutely about family and generational trauma and all of that, it's also about ADHD. And the creatives have specifically said that, ADHD was a part of this story. And the functioning of the piece is like an allegory for ADHD and how the ADHD mind works. And I do not have ADHD, but my husband does. And when I watched that for the first time, I just cried at the end of it because I was like, oh my gosh, this character is you. This is 100% you. And nowhere in the film do they even say ADHD. It just is. It just exists that way. And that's really what I wish we had more.
It just we need to give audiences a bit more credit in general. We can handle it.
And just realize how diverse your audience is too. I always found it so funny that people are still like, unless it is this white male superhero with a gun, no one will care about it or the story. And I'm like, I love a good, action movie, all of those sorts of things. But also, have you watched queer, disabled Afro surrealism?
Every audience is not the cis-het white male between 18 and 34.
Right. Well, and again, you're like, disability is 25% of the population. We literally have the data on that being $1 trillion untapped marketplace just from disabled people and people who know and are friends with disabled people. Because even if I am not a wheelchair user, I'm not going to go see the Me Before You, which poorly represents, friends of mine. It doesn't even matter what the connection is. If somebody in my community says, nope, that's not me, don't watch that, don't support that, then I'm not doing it. So you're not just losing that person, you're losing all the people who know and care about that person and all the people who know what that space actually looks like and what that authentic space actually is, who can spot really easily that you're doing it wrong.
Yeah. So let's all be better. And thank goodness you are around to help everyone do that. What have I not asked you about that I should have asked you about?
I think that the only thing that I always love to spout off is just tons of people who are doing really, really great work. I think that's a piece that we miss so often too, that people so often fall into, oh, well, we really wanted this, but we couldn't find anybody. Or we really wanted this writer, this director, this actor to be authentic, but nobody exists yet, which is also just not true. So
Just not true.
Not true at all. And I already mentioned Inevitable Foundation. They're really wonderful. I work a lot with RespectAbility, which is another nonprofit org that has an entire alumni system and lab program for disabled creatives. That's directors, that's writers, that's producers, it's casting folks, it's tons of people. I've worked with Ariel Bosca a bunch, who runs a nonprofit called Ride the Omnibus. And we're actually doing another conference, which is called Accessibility in Horror, which is taking place July 8th and 9th. And that is entirely focused on, disabled creatives, on cripping the lens, on why there's such a connection, especially for queer disabled filmmakers, to genre space in filmmaking, and how that's a whole world in itself. There'll be tons of disabled creatives who are speaking there as well. And Forward Doc is going to be one of the folks who's helping out with that process as well. We're using some of their guidelines for our festival accessibility and the accessibility scorecard that Forward Doc did with the Film Festival Accessibility Group. We'll be a part of that too. So many things again. Forward Doc, Inevitable Foundation, RespectAbility, Ride the Omnibus. And those are just sort of a very small smattering of the groups that are doing things. There's always conferences and talks and just so many things that are taking place in the community that tapping in is really not hard at all. And if you reach out to anybody, the community will connect you to everybody else in the community as well and say, oh, well, we're not the right fit for this, but you know who you should talk to is that person over there. So just getting started can make all the difference.
Okay, we're going to link to all those things in the show notes. And then how can people reach you?
How to reach me. So you can find us at IndieVisibleEntertainment.com. It's spelled like indie film, IndieVisibleEntertainment.com. We have a contact form on there. And that website includes tons of information about all of the many, many things that we do. Again, everything from actually producing content and doing a bunch of in-house stuff as a full production company to production accessibility specific things to helping staff up if you are looking for those writers, directors, producers, casting, all of that, all the way down to, oh, I need this captioned. How do I do that? So really covers a wide range of stuff. We are always happy to do generals with folks just to sort of help start you on your journey of accessibility and disability culture and, where you should go next. We're always very excited about that.
Thank you so much, Kiah Amara. It's been so great to have you on the podcast.
So wonderful to be here. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to The Other 50%, a herstory of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Oliver. Thank you to Kiah Amara for the conversation. Find all the organizations we talked about in the show notes. And special thanks to Jay Rowe, Danny Rosner, and Alice McQuaid for the music. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and rate and leave a review to help people find it. Send it to your friends. If you have a company and you'd like to be a sponsor, please reach out. You can find me and my work at julieharrisoliver.com if you're looking for simple yet effective tools to bring to your productions, or even want some help in starting to talk about it. Give me a call. I'd love to work with you. Thanks for listening. See you next time.